I need to talk to you about something that happened in Berea this week, because if you weren't paying close attention, you probably missed the exact moment the Cleveland Browns quarterback conversation flipped upside down. This isn't hype. This isn't me reaching for a headline. I watched it, I read the reactions from people who were actually in that building, and I'm telling you straight, the story everyone thought they understood walked into training camp and got rewritten in real time. Here's what everybody assumed going in. Deshaun Watson, the man with the massive contract, the man the front office bet the entire future of this franchise on, was going to walk onto that practice field, take command, and remind the city of Cleveland why he's still the starter. That was the script. That was the safe, boring, predictable outcome nobody questioned. And then Shedeur Sanders showed up to camp, and he did not play the part he was assigned. He did not look like a young player scrapping for table scraps behind a locked-in starter. He looked like a man who already knew something the rest of us were still trying to figure out. Let me give you the real context here, because this isn't your typical summer quarterback battle. Most quarterback competitions are two unproven guys fighting for a job the fan base barely cares about yet. This one is loaded, with money, with history, with a fan base so scarred by years of quarterback disasters that they're almost scared to believe in anything good again. Watson is coming off two separate Achilles ruptures, not one bad injury, two full tears of the exact same tendon, one of the cruelest rehab processes a professional athlete can go through. And before any of that happened to his body, understand this, the man was a legitimate nightmare for opposing defenses. He nearly carried a Houston team on his back by himself. So, we're not talking about some washed-up veteran hanging onto a roster spot out of habit. We're talking about a genuinely talented quarterback trying to convince his own legs that they can still do what his brain remembers doing. And into that exact pressure cooker walks a guy who's technically in year 2, supposed to be quietly developing behind the scenes without anyone paying too much attention. Except Shedeur Sanders has never done a single thing quietly in his life. From the very first snap in pads and a helmet, no scripted sound bites, just him playing football in front of coaches who don't care about narratives, he looked completely settled, like someone who already knew exactly what kind of player he was. That should terrify Cleveland's coaching staff in the best possible way, because it means the decision they thought they'd already made might not be as settled as they hoped. Here's the truth nobody tells you about training camp battles. They're almost never decided by one highlight reel throw. They're decided in the small, quiet moments that never make it onto anybody's feed. The way a guy reacts after an incomplete pass, the way he claps the huddle together, the look in his eyes when the pressure ramps up in a rep that means nothing on a scoreboard, but everything to a coaching staff figuring out who they can trust in the fourth quarter with the season on the line. And from everything I've watched, Shedeur wasn't rattled by a single second of it. He didn't look like a guy hoping to be allowed to stick around. He looked like a guy who belonged there. Now, I want to be fair to Watson here, because this isn't a hit piece. The man has real talent, real NFL experience, and real personal scars that have nothing to do with his ability to throw a football. But here's the brutal reality he now has to live with. Every throw he makes this camp gets measured against the guy standing a few feet away from him in that quarterback room. That comparison didn't exist by accident. Cleveland created it the moment they gave Shedeur a legitimate opportunity instead of burying him on the clipboard for another 2 seasons. Watson never asked for this. But it's here now, whether he wants it or not. Think about the psychology here, because people drastically underestimate how mental quarterback competitions actually are. Watson walks into this camp with everything to lose. Every incomplete pass turns into a headline within minutes. Every hesitant read gets clipped and replayed before he's even off the field. He's not simply trying to win reps. He's trying to justify years of investment, years of what-if conversations that have followed this organization since the day they made that controversial trade. That's a crushing weight to carry, especially for a man coming off major surgery to the exact tendon responsible for planting, pushing off, and throwing with confidence. Shedeur doesn't carry a single ounce of that weight. He's not defending anything. He's chasing something. And chasing is a completely different mental space than protecting. When you're protecting a job, every mistake feels catastrophic. When you're chasing an opportunity, every good rep feels like proof you belong. That's the invisible edge Shedeur walked into camp carrying, and I genuinely believe it could end up being the deciding factor in how this entire summer plays out for the Cleveland Browns. I heard an analyst frame this in a way that stuck with me. Shedeur came out of OTAs and minicamp already flashing enough to turn heads, and if he keeps stacking those flashes into real training camp performances, it applies genuine pressure on the coaching staff. Coaches don't want to make franchise quarterback decisions off vibes. They want tape. And if that tape says the guy who was supposed to be the backup is outplaying the man penciled in as QB1, that becomes a conversation that gets louder every week, whether the organization wants it to or not. Let's talk about Todd Monken for a second, because this man didn't come to Cleveland to babysit a stagnant quarterback room. He arrived with a proven track record of building offenses that function, and his approach isn't about protecting one man's ego or shielding one man's contract from criticism. It's about identifying whoever gives this team the best realistic chance to win. He's been open that this is a young, still developing roster, and refreshingly honest that both Watson and Shedeur turned in strong spring performances. That's not the kind of vague thing a coach says to avoid a headline. When a head coach admits both quarterbacks looked genuinely good, what he's really telling you is that this decision isn't going to make itself. Somebody in that room has to separate from the pack, and soon. Here's the part of this story I think gets criminally overlooked. There's an old cynical line in NFL quarterback rooms. If you've got two starting quarterbacks, what you actually have is none. A locker room smells hesitation from a mile away. Players crave clarity. They want to know exactly who is leading them into Sunday, so they can build real trust, real rhythm, the kind of chemistry that shows up when a game is hanging in the balance with 2 minutes on the clock. Cleveland doesn't have unlimited time to sort this out. They've got a handful of camp weeks before this gets decided by performance, or by default because one man holds the bigger contract. Let's sit with Shedeur's first real impression on that field, because it deserves more than a passing mention. This wasn't even pads yet, helmets only, non-contact work, the lightest version of camp football imaginable. In that low-stakes setting, body language matters almost as much as substance, because every coach on that field is watching how a player carries himself just as closely as ball placement. Shedeur didn't flinch. He didn't glance around to check if the cameras were catching his best angle. He looked completely locked in, moving with a rhythm that suggested he'd already mentally rehearsed this moment 100 times before it happened. That kind of composure isn't something a coaching staff installs overnight. Either a guy has it naturally, or the moment swallows him whole. Shedeur did not get swallowed. Now I know what some of you are already thinking, because this criticism has followed Shedeur since before he ever put on a Browns uniform. The idea that he's more interested in the spotlight and the brand than the unglamorous grind of football. I've heard that take repeated over and over, and I'll tell you what I think of it. It's lazy analysis. A player can do a photo shoot on a Tuesday and still be completely locked in on football by Wednesday. Those two things have never been mutually exclusive. If we're going to judge this young man, judge him on what happens between the white lines. Give him a fair opportunity, let the tape talk, and if he struggles when the stakes get real, that's a fair conversation. But writing him off before he's even had a real shot because of how he presents himself off the field, that's not evaluation. That's a narrative searching for an excuse. So let's bring this back to the actual football, because that's ultimately where this story gets decided. Right now, on paper, Watson still holds a real edge. He's the more experienced player. He understands NFL coverage disguises, pressure packages, and game speed in a way only years of live snaps can teach a quarterback. He's seen blitz looks Shedeur likely hasn't encountered yet. That experience matters. But experience can only protect a job for so long once the guy standing behind you starts closing that gap in real time. Paper doesn't throw touchdown passes, tape does. And if Shedeur keeps producing clean, decisive football while Watson looks a step behind where this organization needs him to be, that advantage erodes faster than anyone in that front office would like to admit. Let me walk you through the domino effect I genuinely believe we're about to watch unfold over these next several weeks. One strong practice from Shedeur creates a little buzz. A fun story, nothing more. 2 strong practices in a row, and that buzz transforms into real scrutiny. Reporters start asking pointed questions in press conferences. Coaches start fielding questions they'd rather avoid this early. 3 strong practices in a row, and you're no longer discussing a depth chart formality. You're discussing the biggest storyline inside that building, one dictating practice reps, national coverage, and possibly the entire trajectory of the Browns' season. Once that shift genuinely starts, it becomes incredibly difficult to stop, because football is a copycat, momentum-driven sport. Wide receivers run their routes with different confidence when they trust the arm throwing them the ball. Offensive linemen communicate differently when the voice in the huddle sounds sure of itself instead of rattled. Even the defense, lined up across during situational periods, quietly notices which quarterback refuses to look intimidated. None of that shows up in a box score. But every coach in that building is watching for exactly that, because it reveals more about genuine leadership than any stat sheet ever could. Let's also be honest about what's genuinely at stake for Watson personally, because I don't think it's fair to discuss this competition without acknowledging the human side of it. This is a man who has weathered a legal and personal storm that followed him for years, on top of a catastrophic set of injuries that would have ended most careers. He's trying to rebuild trust with an organization, a fan base, and honestly with himself, while a confident, hungry young quarterback breathes down his neck the entire time. That is not an easy environment for anyone. But sympathy and job security are 2 completely different currencies in professional football, and Cleveland doesn't have the luxury of sentiment if the tape says somebody else gives them a better chance to win. What makes Shedeur genuinely dangerous in this moment isn't one unbelievable throw or one viral clip. It's the total absence of hesitation in how he's operating out there. Young quarterbacks under this scrutiny usually fall into one of 2 traps. Either they get too aggressive, forcing throws into windows that shouldn't exist because they're desperate to prove something, or they get too passive, playing scared because one mistake gets magnified into a national storyline. From what I've watched, Shedeur hasn't fallen into either trap. He looks patient. He looks like a guy who trusts his reads instead of manufacturing highlight plays just to chase headlines. That patience matters more than most people realize, because pads are about to change everything. Right now, we're watching quarterbacks operate in a controlled, low-pressure environment. No live pass rush, no bodies flying at real NFL velocity. Once full pads go on, timing windows shrink, defenders close faster, and every hesitation gets punished immediately. That's when we'll actually learn who these 2 quarterbacks really are under genuine duress. Shedeur passed the first test, which was simply looking like he belonged. The next test is significantly harder, and it's coming fast. Here's what I keep circling back to when I really think about how this whole thing plays out. Watson is essentially being asked to be great just to maintain the status quo he already holds. If he plays well, the reaction around the league is basically, well, that's exactly what a starting quarterback with his resume is supposed to do. There's no bonus excitement baked into that outcome because it's simply expected of him. But if Shedeur produces that exact same level of football, the entire tone of the conversation shifts instantly, because it isn't expected. It's a discovery, a revelation. That imbalance in how each man's performance gets perceived is genuinely brutal for Watson, even if it isn't entirely fair to him as a person. But perception drives conversation. Conversation drives pressure, and pressure eventually drives decisions. Even the kind of decisions a coaching staff swore up and down they'd never make emotionally. I also think we have to talk about what all of this means for Todd Monken personally, because whatever happens here becomes his defining signature decision as Cleveland's offensive mastermind. If he sticks with Watson purely out of loyalty to the financial investment the front office already made, and Watson goes on to struggle, that decision follows Monken around for the rest of this season and probably longer. If he benches or delays Watson in favor of Shedeur, and the younger quarterback ends up struggling instead, that decision follows him just as hard, just as publicly. There is no version of this scenario where Monken gets to quietly hide behind his roster. Whatever he ultimately decides, he owns that choice completely and permanently, And I genuinely believe that's exactly why he's being so deliberately careful about not naming a starter this early in the process. He understands, probably better than any of us watching from the outside, that the margin for error here is essentially non-existent. So where does all of this actually leave us as we head into the next stretch of training camp? Watson still holds the built-in advantage of experience, contract security, and organizational trust. That's real, and I'm not going to sit here and pretend it isn't, but favorite and safe have never been the same word in professional football, especially not in a results-driven business where fans, media, and eventually front offices stop caring about backstory the second on-field performance starts telling a different, louder story. Shedeur doesn't need to completely dominate Watson in a single practice to change this entire conversation. He simply needs to keep doing exactly what he did on that very first day. Show up composed, make the right decisions consistently, protect the football, and let every clean, sharp rep quietly chip away at the assumption that this job was already decided before camp even began. There's one more layer to this story that I don't think gets discussed enough, and it has absolutely nothing to do with arm strength, footwork, or reading coverages. It's the fan base itself. Cleveland has endured more failed quarterback experiments than almost any franchise in modern football history. Names have cycled through that building for years, each one arriving carrying promise, and eventually leaving behind nothing but disappointment. And that painful history has left this fan base emotionally guarded in a way that's almost self-protective at this point. They've learned, the hard way, not to fall in love too quickly with anyone wearing that helmet. But Shedeur represents something they genuinely haven't had in a very long time. Hope that isn't just manufactured hype from a press release. Hope that's actually backed up by real things people are seeing with their own eyes on the practice field. Every strong day he strings together doesn't just build his case with the coaching staff behind closed doors. It builds a genuine groundswell of belief in the stands and across social media that eventually becomes its own unique form of pressure on this organization. Front offices love to publicly claim they completely ignore outside noise, but no organization on earth is truly immune to the mood of the city it represents, especially once that mood starts leaning hard and unmistakably in one direction. And that's precisely why the next few weeks matter so much more than a typical forgettable training camp battle usually would. This isn't just about who wins football games in September. This is about which direction this entire franchise commits itself to for the next several years of its existence. If Watson reclaims control and genuinely looks like the pre-injury version of himself, Cleveland gets to feel like their patience and their financial commitment finally paid off in full. If Shedeur keeps climbing and forces this decision directly into his own hands, the Browns get to feel like they discovered their long-term franchise answer a full year ahead of schedule. Either outcome fundamentally reshapes how this franchise gets built moving forward, which is exactly why nobody inside that building is treating these practices as routine, even if they're publicly calling it business as usual for the cameras. I'll leave you with this thought. Competitions like this one almost never get settled in one single, dramatic, unforgettable moment that everybody remembers years later. They get settled quietly, rep by rep, practice by practice, until one day the coaching staff looks up and realizes the decision has essentially made itself without anyone officially announcing it. Watson still has every opportunity in the world to shut this entire conversation down completely, simply by playing like the seasoned veteran Cleveland believed they were originally getting. But if he doesn't, if that gap keeps closing the exact same way it did on day one, Shedeur Sanders isn't going to need anybody to hand him a single thing. He's simply going to go out there and take it, one confident, composed practice at a time.